Okay, so what we've been doing so far is pretty standard Mendelian genetics. Sometimes we call it transmission genetics, in which case we're pretty clear about understanding, the underlying cause being one particular gene. Maybe it's a dominant gene, maybe it's a recessive gene, and there are plenty of conditions that might be understood under those terms. Okay, now the project that you guys are going to be working on is about inherited conditions generally. And what you might find is that if you come across a condition that you're really intrigued by, you want to learn about it, but the inheritance is not as simple and cut and dried as a dominant gene or a recessive gene. Okay. As long as it's got some inherited component, that makes it fair game for this project. Okay. I guess skip down to the bottom. That's my message. Don't be afraid. Okay? Don't say, oh, well, whoa, this is just too complicated. I'm not going to be able to understand it. I'm going to pick something that interests me less, but I know that I'll be able to explain it because I understand it more clearly. That's not the objective. I mean, I think you should, align your expectations on this, not to be an expert and be able to give expert information about the conditions that you research, but learn something, right? Learn as much as you can. That's kind of like the thing. I want you to learn as much as you can, and then share what you learned with your classmates who probably are going to learn from your presentation. And that's the kind of spirit that I want you to have as you're approaching this project. Okay. Now, having said that, okay, I want to spend today's video on some of the things that might be underlying as a mechanism for the genetic inherited condition that you decide to work on. Okay, one of which we've actually kind of talked about already. Chromosomal disorders. Right, we talked about Down syndrome. There's Turner syndrome, Klinefelter syndrome, triple X syndrome. I mean, there are things that are basically aneuploid conditions. There are other kinds of chromosomal disorders that might involve some problems. There's one called Fragile X, which is a chromosomal disorder that has some impact on the I guess, okay, I'm no expert on this, but on the structural integrity of the X chromosome, right? And so, there are plenty of other mechanisms that don't necessarily follow, well, here's the gene, here's another allele, a mutant allele that causes the disease. Here's what happens as a result of having a mutant allele, right? You could choose a condition that is inherited, but the underlying mechanism has something to do with chromosomes, right? We've already discussed that. And so what I want to do is to give you a little bit of a taster, of a sampler about the different kinds of conditions different kinds of mechanisms that might be there in the disorder that you consider. The first one isn't, actually, when I look at the first one, this might not necessarily be a disorder. Okay? In fact, when I think of my main complaint as an evolutionary biologist about the way that people learn about genetics, and people learn genetics and they expect you to be a homozygote or a heterozygote or the other homozygote. You have to be either a dominant trait, or you have to have either the dominant trait or the recessive trait. Okay. How does that apply to something like body size? Okay. Does that apply to like body size in the sense that you come in two sizes, a small and a large, and maybe the small is recessive and the large is dominant, or maybe the small is dominant and large is recessive? I mean, would you even think that's a plausible kind of explanation? No, of course not, right? You know that body size is something where you have this completely contiguous range. We call it a normal distribution. You would have the smallest individual over here, the largest individual over here, and the closer you get towards the average, the median, right, the higher the frequency. And so we've got all these characteristics in which we've got a continuous distribution of phenotype ranging from a small value to a large value. This could be something as behavioral, like preference or tolerance, preference for / tolerance of country music, right? Maybe people are entirely intolerant of country music. That would be me. Okay. Maybe other people are just crazy about country music because that's the only thing that they consider to be music. Definitely not me, right? And then you have people in between that have different levels of tolerance for it, right? And so, I don't know, maybe there's some kind of genetic underlying condition. It's not that you have the country music lovers and the country music haters, and one is a dominant trait. No, I mean, it could be body size, it could be a physical characteristic, it could be a behavioral characteristic. There are lots of interesting phenotypes, things that you could actually look at, measure, and determine about an individual that are not going to be inherited simply on the basis of dominant trait, recessive trait. Right? And so when this occurs, we generally think, first thing we think about is polygenic. In other words, you might have 3 genes, or you might have 30 genes, or you might have 300 genes, different genes, and they all contribute a little bit to what you'd become, right? So your body size might be large because you have a whole bunch of genes that make you incrementally larger, or you might be small because you don't have those genes that make you larger. And if you're not larger, then by default, you must be smaller, right? And so there are conditions that similarly have different levels of severity, right? So maybe you have a very severe form of a disease. You might have a very mild form of a disease. Maybe the absence of the condition would be one extreme, and most pronounced expression of the condition might be the one where you've got the greatest number of genes causing you to have that condition. So in other words, it's entirely plausible to me that somebody is going to say, well, my gene is, or the condition that I choose to study comes in many levels of severity, and it depends on whether you've got one genetic factor or multiple genetic factors or a huge number of genetic factors that make you more predisposed to having this condition, right? Yeah. What could be? Maybe something like cholesteremia, right? Because not everybody has the same level of cholesterol-related challenges to your vascular physiology, right? Some people are not affected at all. Some people have mild cholesteremia. Some people have even more severe cholesteremia. Some people just have to deal with cholesterol issues every day of their life, right? And maybe that could be an example of a condition where you've got many genes that all contribute to the severity of your cholesterol concerns for your cardiovascular health, right? So yeah, I mean, this is one possibility. And again, I mean, I'm telling you this because this is pretty interesting, right? It's interesting to me. I'm guessing it might be interesting to some people in class. And I don't want you to shy away from it just because you can't nail it down to a single gene that's recessive or dominant. Okay, so maybe you're not completely happy with it, but yeah, be aware that that's one possibility. Okay. Another thing that you might come across is the fact that not every gene and not every condition is caused exclusively by the genetics, right? Sometimes it's a composition. It's a team effort. You have a genetic predisposition to a particular condition, but you also have to have a diet that is going to cause you to have cholesteremia, right? So cholesteremia might be one of those conditions where you've got genes that make you more predisposed to having high cholesterol, but you could also have the effect of your diet either making or breaking the difference between your developing atheromas in your lifespan or not, right? And so, yeah, the environment may be a pretty significant factor in addition to the genetic causes for a particular genetic inherited condition. And you want to be able to talk about that as well. this is not an unusual thing, right? And I'm sure that you could probably think, even without doing any studying, you could probably think about a number of conditions where you've got some combination of genes and the environment that make you more or less predisposed to developing a condition. Okay? This one, the next one, cytoplasmic inheritance, is coming, it's kind of like a follow-up of something we discussed earlier in the semester. Remember mitochondria? Okay. And mitochondria have their own genome. So you've got a mitochondrial genome. Okay. And what happens if you've got a bad gene in your mitochondria, right? In other words, if there's a condition that's caused by a faulty genetic state in the mitochondrial genome, the inheritance of that is not going to follow the same pattern as what we were talking about before with dominance and recessiveness, because that really only applies to those genes that are there inside of the nucleus on your chromosomes, right? You don't have chromosomes with the genes that are there inside of your mitochondria. And there are a handful of really interesting conditions in which cytoplasmic inheritance is a real factor, right? And so most of these are genes that affect musculature or some metabolically intensive, remember mitochondria are primarily responsible for ATP production, and ATP is most important for those tissues where there's a lot of ATP consumption. So highly metabolically active areas of your body, like musculature, tend to be the ones that are most affected by these mitochondrial genome carried diseases, right? And yeah, it's a possibility. Maybe you might be intrigued by this phenomenon. As you might even let this phenomenon be what triggers you to choose a disease in which the inheritance is not your standard inheritance through the Mendelian fashion. It's actually inherited through a mechanism involving the mitochondria, right? Pleiotropy, or sometimes people say pleiotropy. One gene, several effects, right? And this is actually potentially interesting for some of you that are going to be talking, even for some of you that are talking about single genes, right? Single genetic mutations, because sometimes you'll have a gene that has one impact on your ability to carry hemoglobin, to carry oxygen. Like a good example, this would be sickle cell, right? And so if you have a sickle cell gene, there's a direct effect on your ability to carry oxygen with your hemoglobin, right? But there's a second effect on your susceptibility to malaria, right? And so you've got to take into account both things. The effect on susceptibility to malaria might be beneficial, whereas the effect on your ability to carry oxygen might be deleterious or might have a negative effect, right? And so sometimes I think in your outline, in your research outline, one of the things you're asked is that if you're talking about a single gene, are there any known beneficial effects of having this mutation? And that would be an example of pleiotropy. Okay. There might be other situations where you might identify this particular gene, APOE1, right? Which might have one effect on cholesteremia. I'm making this up. Okay. In other words, you get a positive effect of cholesteremia, but a negative effect on Alzheimer's. Makes you more likely to develop Alzheimer's, right? So in other words, you might have a negative effect on one side, a positive effect on another side. And this is something that you should be looking for, paying attention to, particularly when you come to identified genes, for which there's going to be a lot of information. All right. Okay? And now another thing that you might be coming across as you're looking for conditions are genome-wide associations, these GWAs. Okay, yeah, this is one of the things you might even be aware of if you've done an Ancestry.com or 23andMe analysis. You might have the health reports, and so if you've got if you have one particular genetic marker, if you've got gene X, right, this is going to make you 10% more likely to develop Alzheimer's, 20% less likely to develop heart disease, 15% more likely to have premature hair loss. Okay, now that we have a whole lot of information from millions of people about these particular genetic markers, okay, we might actually be able to ascertain things about, well, you've got these genetic risks, but you've got these genetic benefits from these particular genes, right? And this applies. This is where we get at another consideration, and your book talks about this. I've assigned you some reading on this, and I'm doing this for the next lecture. But take into consideration the ethical considerations about having this kind of knowledge about your own genetic predispositions to developing one disease or another disease over the remainder of your lifespan, right? And so, I think it's an interesting thing to talk about this. I'll be discussing with you what the real things are that I want you to focus on in the next video, right? And I hope I didn't scare you off this video. If you have any questions at all about a condition that you're considering, if you're worried that your condition might be too difficult for you, talk to me. I will tell you why it's not too difficult for you. Right? That is what I will tell you. And so you might be aware of that. But there's no single condition that would be undoable by anybody, right? If you have a condition that might be caused by genes A, B, C, D, E, ... if you have a condition for which there might be 12 different known genes, and you're looking at this and saying, well, I am going to be totally overwhelmed if I have to talk about 12 different genes. I will tell you, no, you don't have to talk about 12 genes. Just take the two that are the most important, the ones that have the greatest impact on the development of that condition, and talk about those two, right? Don't worry about the rest of them unless you happen to be interested in them. Maybe you want to ignore these two and talk about this one and that one because those are the ones that for some reason are of greater interest to you, right? And so, what I want you to realize is that this project is supposed to be a sizable project. It should be a challenge to you, but it should not be overwhelming. It should not be such an enormous amount of work that it should be something you should be scared about. Okay. I'm getting ahead of myself. I want to give you all that information, like part of the information, with the next lecture. So we're ending right here.